The turn of each season allows us to appreciate something new about the natural environments around us. The sharp crispness of a slow winter morning, the fresh growth of spring bulbs accompanied by birdsong, baskets of summer blooms with insects abuzz, and in the autumn, the bounty of produce from gardens, allotments, and orchards. Orchards were once a common sight in larger domestic gardens and farmsteads, but over recent decades, the pressure for development has seen many small orchards disappear, and modern back gardens can seem too small for such a luxury. At Landmark, we have been bucking this trend and planting fruit trees wherever we can. They make good companions to our historic properties, with stories to tell that are in tune with that of our buildings. Pears, plums, quinces, greengages, and of course apples can all be found in our orchards. Choosing the right tree needn't be daunting and can lead you on a journey of discovery about local traditions, vernacular buildings, and people of character. Wade Muggleton from the Marcher Apple Network tells us more about the satisfaction of planting an apple tree and his own fascination with this tree of plenty.
Well, I live in just on the Shropshire border in a little village called Stotterston, and I've got a collection of 105 different varieties of apple, which I started in, well, I've got 30 varieties in the garden, which I started about 18 years ago. And then in my orchard up the road, I've got another 75 varieties, which I started in 2013. So they're sort of in their 7th season now. And it was just an overgrazed sheep field, so it was a complete blank canvas to start with. I'm very interested in apples from their sort of historic and social. They've all got stories to tell about where they came from, why they've got that name, who found them or bred them, were they once popular and then fell from favour, or were they never that widespread in the first place? So I think they're interesting sort of social and local history, really. So my collection is a slightly random collection of I say, just over 100 varieties. They're mostly sort of Worcestershire, Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, Welsh border type varieties, but I have got a few other ones like from abroad. I've got a couple of French varieties, Scottish ones. So it's just a sort of random collection of ones that I found and thought were interesting. So some of them in my collection are probably only in half a dozen places in the whole world. There's a few really, really rare ones. I'm also the secretary of the Marcher Apple Network, which is a regional apple group that was started over 20 odd years ago to try and find and propagate some of the varieties, the historic varieties of the Welsh Marcher region, which were in danger of being lost or disappeared. And a few had disappeared. We had descriptions and names of them, but through sort of apple days and events and talking to people, we have managed to rediscover a few of them, which weren't in the national collection. You couldn't buy them anywhere. So yeah, we're sort of in the game of apple detectives, I call it, looking for these heritage varieties. Yeah, identifying apples can be extremely difficult. We have this saying that rarities are rare because we rarely find them. You know, most times people turn up with Bramleys and James Greaves and Coxes and Worcesters and things that you would expect to find. And often if you ask somebody about the age of the tree, it's the varieties that were popular at that time, and they crop up again and again. The trouble with really old trees is that they tend to produce undersized, slightly diseased, scabby looking fruit, which makes it even more difficult to identify. We are now, though, moving into the realms of DNA. So the National Fruit Collection at Brogdale have DNA'd all the known apples in the country. So you can send in a sample and they'll compare it. So even if it's a slightly scabby, manky looking one, the DNA obviously doesn't lie. So if it matches something, it'll tell you what that match is with the national collection. If it comes back as no match, then it's something different, something that's not in the national collection. And it could be one of these historic varieties, or it could just be a random seedling that grew from a pip. Because the thing that most people don't realize about apples is when you grow one from a pip, you don't get the same apple it came out of, you get something different. It's a cross between the apple it came out of and whatever the insects pollinated it with. So every time you grow a seedling, a pip from an apple, you get something new. So the reason, the way in which varieties are propagated is by grafting. So to get a copy, you have to have a grafted tree of the one you're after. Otherwise, you're just growing something new every time. So sometimes what people bring in might just be a pip that was planted by a child or somebody long ago. But there are lots of descriptions from the 17 and 1800s of apple varieties that we can't place them today. So sometimes we never will find the answer, and sometimes there is enough information to go on and we manage to rediscover these historic varieties. The apples eaten today commercially is from a staggeringly small pool of varieties. I believe in Britain about half the apples eaten are Gala and about half of the rest are Braeburn. So that means that 3/4 of the apples we eat in this country are of 2 varieties. The reason it's worth keeping these varieties going is for securing the gene pool, really. If in the future we have problems with disease or climate change or something, and we need to have that gene bank to call on to breed more resilient different types of things, if we've lost all that, it becomes a very, very narrow gene pool. But yeah, commercial varieties, there's probably only 5 or 6 varieties in most supermarkets that people would ever see, and yet there's well over 2,000, maybe nearly 3,000 British varieties alone. But most people sadly never get to see or taste them because they're just not available in the shops, which is why we always say to people, if you're going to plant an orchard, go and seek out something that's unusual, something of your area. You don't want to grow something you can buy in the shops, and most of the ones in the shops are grown very intensely, probably sprayed quite a bit to get them to look like those perfect apples, so they won't necessarily do as well in your garden with sort of minimal attention. But some of these old varieties are quite happy just to sit in the corner of a cottage garden and crop for years and years. And there is something magnificent about walking out into the garden and picking an apple off the tree and eating it, but it's an apple that you can't buy anywhere, so you'll never see it in the shop. So I'm always saying to people, if you're going to plant a tree, grow something you can't buy anywhere. I think that's a nice idea, nice notion. The theory of growing local varieties is that they are accustomed to the climate, the conditions, the soils of your area. Most of the modern commercial varieties come from the other side of the world. Things like Gala and Braeburn originated in New Zealand. Golden Delicious came from America, Granny Smith from Australia. Whereas if you grow something like Worcester pear Main that came from Worcester, the theory is in Worcestershire, it's the area it's suited to. So if you go and find a local apple of your area, the theory is it should be quite happy in your area because that's where it came from originally. So we do advocate that sort of local distinctiveness, really, of growing a variety. And there's also an element of don't always believe what you read in the books, because I think generally there's a perception that apples don't do very well above about 700 or 800 feet. But along Offers Dyke and the Welsh borders, you can find apples growing at well over 1,000 feet on some of these hill farms quite happily. So some varieties are definitely more hardy than others. My own orchard is 600 feet up in the Shropshire Hills on a northwest facing slope, so it's not ideal. And of my 100 odd trees, some of them will thrive and survive at that, and others probably won't like it. So in 10 years time, I may have lost a few, may have gained a few. But it's definitely, well, I suppose it's like anything. There are preferences to climate, altitude, exposure that some varieties will do better than others. Well, when orchards are very young, you shouldn't allow anything to grow around the base of the tree to start with for the first few years, because when the roots are shallow and near the surface, they compete with the weeds and the grasses for nutrient and moisture. But as the orchard develops and gets older, a sort of flower-rich mixture, old-fashioned sort of hay meadow type mix, is fantastic, because that will draw in all the insects, which will then pollinate your fruit trees for you. There's a lot of emphasis at the moment on pollinators and the decline nationally in insects. So yeah, rather than just a boring sort of modern ryegrass, to have an understory that's got a wonderful mix of wildflowers in it. And not only that, the insects come in, but then the birds will come in, and you get the whole sort of ecosystem and the food chain building up with it. So definitely we're very big on encouraging pollinators, wildflower mixes, and grown underneath orchards. And interestingly, with orchards, people often say that they assume it's all about trees, but it is as much about the sward and how you manage that. So do you cut it once a year like a hay meadow, or do you let a few sheep in there? But if you let the sheep in, you've then got to protect the trees, because the sheep will nibble the trees as well. So the actual orchard management can be a bit more complex in terms of working out what's best for your site. But definitely pollinators is the big subject at the moment. certainly in the west side of the country, then cider was a huge part of rural life, and it was said that the itinerant workforce would come and work for you on the basis of your reputation for cider, and if somebody down the road cider was deemed to be better than yours, they might go and cast their labour there instead of with you. So it was a huge part of rural life, and probably the majority of apples grown on a lot of these farms went into cider rather than were eaten. And so cider and perry has that sort of association with Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, and Somerset and Devon, the West Country. So it was indeed a big part of rural life. And although officially there was a decree called the Truck Act, which banned people being part paid in alcohol, but I think actually it went on for yonks after that unofficially. So it was, and people must have been quite hard in those days. If you were working hard on the land and you could drink cider at lunchtime and then do another half a day's work, they must have been tough people, is all I can say. Be drinking cider on a warm summer's lunchtime and then going back to work, I would have thought was something they must have been used to. So. There is a cider making culture in the eastern counties of sort of Norfolk and Suffolk, but interestingly over there they just make it out of cookers and eaters because they don't have a culture of growing specific cider apples, whereas Somerset and Herefordshire have this very strong heritage of growing these little hard cider apples that you can't eat because they're so bitter, but they have very high tannin content, which makes good cider. So there's a real specialist sort of rivalry really between Somerset and Herefordshire over who are the best cider makers, whereas they do make very good cider in Suffolk and Norfolk, but they don't make it out of cider apples, they just use cookers and eaters. So you can make cider out of any apple. It's not true that you can only make cider out of cider apples. You can use absolutely anything, and they probably did. You know, people were much more creative and less sort of fussy, and poverty was part of life, so you used what was around, and if you had a load of whatever left over, or you got some windfalls, or a neighbour wasn't using their fruit, you would probably just take it and use it. But cider was definitely a big part of life in the western sort of counties of the country anyway. There's a little bit of people sort of think of cider a bit like wine, and that you would keep it for ages, whereas cider would have been drunk within the 12-month period, because then you'd make the next batch. So it was probably made in the autumn, matured over the winter, and then drunk the following season. I have a theory that the rural poor used to make cider and drink it at Christmas. So they'd make it in September and October, and they'd drink it at Christmas because they had no other money for cheer. But the thing about cider is it's one of those subjects where every kind of old countryman and woman will tell you something different. So I think there's all sorts of theories, and you should never drink it till you hear the first cuckoo, or all these kind of how long you should leave it, whether you should ferment it in the warm or leave it outside in the cold to ferment slowly, and everyone just gives you a different story, but what works really. So it's definitely one of those things that's sort of wrapped up in rural myth and storytelling, and you don't want to do it like that, boy, you want to do it like this, you know. So there's an awful lot of rural association with cider making, and perry, to be fair, which is a more obscure drink, but Gloucestershire and the three counties were sort of quite renowned for that, really. So